Our last two speakers will address subjects other than the New York pictures, too. Richard Kagan is the Arthur O. Lovejoy Professor Emeritus of History and Academy Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. A graduate of Columbia University and Cambridge University, he has received grants from the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, the Fulbright Association, the Getty Trust, the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and others, too. His interest in El Greco dates to his undergraduate days at Columbia and first crystallized in his essay Toledo of El Greco, published in the catalog accompanying the exhibition El Greco of Toledo, which was held at the National Gallery and other museums in 1982, and that Susan was telling us about this morning. Since then, he has published numerous essays on various aspects of El Greco's career in Toledo, and most recently was the co-organizer of the exhibit El Greco's Friends and Patrons in Toledo, which is currently on display in the Benaki Museum in Athens. Richard is currently working on a book titled The Spanish Craze, America's Discovery of the Arts and Cultures of the Hispanic World from 1890 to 1930, parts of which examine the history of collecting of Spanish art in the United States. He presented a paper on this topic at the symposium Jose Luis and our center did here at the Frick in 2008, but his talk today will relate to his project too, and is titled El Grecophilitis, right? Am I saying it right? In Philadelphia, a Case History. Please welcome the distinguished Richard Kagan.
Thank you. And thank you for staying on despite the weather, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I really wanted to thank, on behalf of all the speakers, everyone responsible here at the Frick Collection for organizing this wonderful symposium despite the weather. So thank you so much, all the members of this history of the collecting, the museum, Samantha, Inga, and the like. Now, is this the right one, number one? Some of you have seen this before. As this cartoon suggests, European old master paintings panicked whenever they saw the likes of J.P. Morgan and other wealthy American collectors enter a room. At the dawn of the 20th century, these collectors had come to buy, and buy they did. And in the process, amassed private collections that ranked among the world's finest and most diverse. And to find out what they had purchased, in the fall of 1911, this character, Dr. Wilhelm Bode, founding curator at Berlin's Kaiser Frederick Museum, now the Bode Museum on that city's Museum Island. Bode spent a month visiting the United States with an eye towards evaluating the country's major private collections, along with several of its museums. And when this tour was over, Bode published a pair of articles in the New York Times that recorded his impressions of what he had seen. He criticized the museums. He disapproved of the long hallways, their over-reliance on skylights, and especially their unprofessional directors. On the other hand, Bode only had praise for the quality of the old masters he had encountered in the country's private collections. He did so, however, with one reservation, and one major reservation: El Greco. El Greco, he wrote, is represented by 12 of his finest examples. I do not quite understand the American appreciation of El Greco. I am repulsed by his style. It is too mannered. Now, Bode was not alone in his criticism of El Greco's style. In 1906, when this picture, you've seen it several times, first went on display in the Met, one prominent collector published a letter in the Times criticizing the museum and its directors for having spent, he calculated, $35,000 on what he called a defective and worthless picture. From an art point of view, he wrote, it is a complete failure as possible. As to composition, it is a jumble carelessly thrown together with badly drawn human figures, seemingly without purpose or artistic unity of colors, end of quote. But this collector, together with Bode, were whistling in the wind. America's love affair with El Greco was well underway and showed no sign of abating. Already in 1904, Bernard Berenson announced that a boom for El Greco was about to begin. And by 1912, Frank Mather, professor of art history at Princeton, referred to America's love affair with the artist as tantamount to a cult. Others would call it Grecomania. And by 1920, one prominent New York artist, Charles Vezin, in a lecture presented in Philadelphia, likened America's craze for El Greco to a virus. He even gave the disease a name, calling it Grecophilitis, and one whose virulence matched such other artistic maladies as Sargentitis, Monetritis, and Seasonitis. I love that. Now, each of these exotic ailments merits diagnosis, but today I want to focus only on one, Grecophilitis. Now, I haven't the time today to trace the complete case history of the disease, nor its etiology, its transmission, and how unchecked it mushroomed into an epidemic that affected collectors throughout the United States. And to be honest, and as we learned this morning from Ellen, in Europe as well. I will focus instead how its collectors in Philadelphia, the city in which Vezin publicly announced the existence of disease. And in fact, I should say, it was in Philadelphia, as you'll learn, that the first outbreak of Grecophilitis in this country took place. Now, Vezin's choice of Philadelphia as the place to make this announcement, to identify this disease, was quite opportune. Now, previous outbreaks, let's get this, right. Previous outbreaks of Grecophilitis had occurred in Europe, notably in Paris, starting around in the 1890s, when initially affected the famed Impressionist artist Edgar Degas, and who subsequently transmitted the disease, the ailment, to Santiago Rusiñol, to Ignacio Zuloaga, and there's the vision of St. John, or the allegory of profane love, that hanging in his studio in northern Spain. He acquired that painting. Zuloaga acquired that painting against the wishes of his friend, the sculptor Auguste Rodin, when the two were visiting the southern Spanish city of Cordoba. I think it was 1905, 1906. Now, precisely how Grecophilitis spread from Paris to the United States, or I should say from in Catalonia and other places to the United States, is not entirely clear. But the evidence suggests that the contagion began with a trio of artists known to frequent both Paris and Madrid, and who crossed the Atlantic on a regular basis. One was Merritt, who it seems to be directly responsible for transmitting the ailment to the New York collectors, the Havermeyers, starting around 1901, 1904, when they first visited, when they went to Spain in 1901, they went in the company of Merritt. Another vector was John Singer Sargent, best known for his interest in Velázquez, but who in June 1895 journeyed especially to the Prado in Madrid to copy works by El Greco. And it was around that time that Sargent also acquired for himself a small version of this artist St. Martin and the Beggar, which is now in Sarasota's Ringling Museum. The third vector, the third artist, was William Merritt Chase, the New York Society artist, and one directly responsible for bringing the ailment to Philadelphia. Chase was another Velázquez enthusiast, but starting around 1900, began to pronounce on the importance of El Greco. Chase also served as the artistic advisor to John B. Johnson, trustee of the Pennsylvania Academy of Art, the forerunner of today's Philadelphia's Museum of Art. And it was in 1901, it might even have been 1900, the dates are not precise, that Chase suggested that the museum add an El Greco to its growing collection of Old Master art. Johnson agreed, initially advancing his own money, about $1,600, to purchase this picture, a large crucifixion with the Virgin and St. John the Baptist that Chase found in the Paris gallery of Georges Benheim. Although the picture is now known to be a studio piece, it was purchased as an El Greco, and Philadelphia's decision to acquire it marks the first time a major U.S. museum allocated funds to purchase a painting by El Greco. Stand aside, Boston. Stand aside, New York. Unfortunately, the museum records fail to indicate when the picture first went on display. It was probably early in 1901. But when it first went up, anecdotal evidence indicates that Chase happened to be there and overheard one visitor remark, and I quote, "Why should a picture so unpleasant be hung upon these walls? Who is responsible for its presence here?" The indignant Chase allegedly responded, quote, "I am proud and happy to state that I am the person responsible for the purchase of that picture, and I would have you understand, sir, that you are standing before the work of a great master." And he probably added something else under his breath, but I won't add that here in public. You can imagine. Well, despite these kinds of criticism, at this point, 1901, the die was cast. Over the next few years following Philadelphia's example, every major North American public museum would acquire at least one work attributed to El Greco. Boston, 1904, on the advice of Sargent. New York, as we've seen, 1905. Chicago, 1906. But by this date, a number of well-heeled private collectors, starting with the Havermeyers, had also succumbed to Grecophilitis. And it did not take long before a series of Philadelphia collectors caught the ailment as well. Now, the first to feel its effects was Johnson, the lawyer, John B. Johnson, whose interest in the collecting of old master art, I have him here, dated to the 1880s, and who eventually acquired so many pictures that in 1915 he built his own museum adjacent to his house on South Broad Street to accommodate them. Now, save for Velázquez, an artist he described as one of the truly great, few really great world's masters, Johnson was not especially keen on the Spanish school, and as early as 1892, he used the term overrated to describe Murillo. Maybe that's why Frick decided, no, I'll buy my own. And Johnson had no interest in El Greco until 1900, when I just noted Chase persuaded him to purchase the Christ on the Cross for the Pennsylvania Museum, and it was acquired out of something called the Wilstach Fund eventually. Well, Johnson's own collecting of El Greco began in 1908 with the insistence of somebody else you've seen today, the art critic Roger Fry, then kind of the roving, then he was the editor of the Burlington already, and who in an article in 1913 attributed El Greco's genius to his isolation and to his strangeness. Well, the first El Greco Fry recommended to Johnson was a portrait of a woman that Manuel Castillo had identified as El Greco's wife in 1908 in his catalog. Well, the portrait belonged to the Marqués de la Vega Inclán, you've heard his name before, who in 1901 had lent it to the Spanish art exhibition at London's Guildhall, probably with the idea of putting it up for sale. And it was undoubtedly there that Fry first caught a glimpse of it. By 1908, needing money to open the El Greco, the House of El Greco, the El Greco Museum in Toledo, and having recognized the extent to which American collectors had fallen for El Greco, Vega Inclán entrusted a number of the artist's pictures to New York's Erich Galleries, then the preeminent U.S. dealer in Spanish Old Master art. And one of these pictures was this female portrait. And upon learning that Johnson had managed to acquire it, Fry wrote, and I quote, "I'm glad you have got that El Greco portrait. It is a most curious and haunting portrait and throws a new light on El Greco's character. It is more balanced and at the same time more tender than anything else I know of him," end of quote. All that may be true, but the attribution turned out to be spurious. Fry's recommendation to Johnson, somewhat better, was a small Pietà, similar to the one we've seen earlier this morning, dating from El Greco's time in Rome, and which Fry located in the Paris gallery of Eugene Frichoff during the spring of 1908. Fry's telegram to Johnson reads, quote, "Pietà, almost a miniature, very unusual quality of color, intense violet sky, and rich local colors. I like it a good deal," end of quote. And when Fry learned that Johnson had acquired the picture, he wrote again, I am glad you got the little El Greco. It is a wonderful tragedy in miniature, and such strange, resplendent, and terrible coloring. End of quote. Fry, moreover, was also instrumental in helping Johnson acquire yet another El Greco, his third, 1913, same year as Frick is buying, this large crucifixion with Virgin and St. John the Baptist, which Johnson later bequeathed to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Now, if Grecophilitis led Fry and Johnson to make some mistakes in their rush to acquire works by El Greco, the same problem affected Peter Widener, another major Philadelphia collector, in a similar way, starting around 1905. That's the year, there's Widener by Sargent, his friend. That's the year Widener purchased the so-called family of El Greco. Another picture which had belonged to who? The Marquis de la Vega Inclán. He was selling the stuff right, left, and center, and who had evidently vouched for its authenticity, perhaps thinking that the Americans knew squat about El Greco. That attribution turned out, however, to be spurious once again, and following Widener's death in 1915, the picture was sold by his heirs to another wealthy Philadelphia collector, Theodore Pitcairn, but more about him later. And then later, even later, it was acquired by the Royal Academy of San Fernando of Fine Arts in Madrid, and it's now hanging it was last on display in Toledo's House of El Greco, but that's another story. Why the Spaniards bought it is another crazy idea. If El Grecophilitis had led Widener to make a mistake in his first picture of El Greco, however, he got it right in October 1906 with the acquisition of the St. Martin and the Virgin with Saints Inez and Tekla. The pictures in question, we've seen it, were previously part of an altarpiece ensemble in Toledo's San Jose Chapel. And that chapel belonged to an old but somewhat impoverished noble family, anxious for cash, eager for cash. The pictures in question were furtively spirited out of Toledo to Paris, and that is where Widener acquired them. But when news of this purchase leaked out, it prompted a furious debate in Spain's parliament, the Cortes, and with some deputies calling for tougher export controls on the nation's artistic treasures, while others stood up and defended the right of private individuals and churches to dispose of these treasures as they saw fit. A great discussion between private interest and the public good. But as the Cortes debated this issue, Widener had his prize El Grecos shipped from Paris to his mansion in Elkins Park, giving them pride of place in the house's central gallery. You can see them at the end. Now, up to this point, El Grecophilitis mainly affected collectors with eclectic tastes and interest in old master art and some impressionist art. And here I'm thinking of the Havermeyers, the Lamans, Henry Frick, Charles Deering in Chicago, in addition to Johnson and Widener in Philadelphia. Starting in the teens, however, in Philadelphia and elsewhere, the element infected collectors whose primary interest was in contemporary art, as we've seen just before in Jose Luis's discussion. That is to say, art collectors who were primarily interested in Impressionists and Expressionists, Cubists, and the other avant-garde artists who featured in the famous New York Armory Show of 1913. Underscoring that spell, and you've heard a lot about this already, indeed, what I think is the reason why El Grecophilitis had become an epidemic was the link that critics had previously established between El Greco's extravagant style, in the sense of individualistic style, and that of Van Gogh, Cézanne, Picasso, Matisse, and other contemporary artists. That linkage began just after the turn of the century. In 1903, for example, when the famed German scholar Carl Justi announced that El Greco was nothing less than a prophet of modernism, the father of modernism. Or when French critics such as Paul Lafont and Maurice Denis established links between the human forms of El Greco and those of Cézanne. It was the same in New York where as early as 1905, the influential critic Charles Kagan touted El Greco's modern art of expression and insisted that his adroit use of distortion, intensification of color, and expressive use of light was the source of much of what is modern in modern art. And so strong was that connection that it prompted another critic to write, and I quote, now we moderns are all looking at El Greco. He links yesterday to today." The critic is a man named C. Lewis Hind. Now we moderns are all looking at El Greco. He links yesterday to today. I love that phrase. And it's also one that does much to explain why another Philadelphia collector, the eccentric Dr. Albert Barnes, was eager to incorporate works by El Greco into his growing collection of contemporary art housed in his house museum in Merritt, a suburban enclave straddling Philadelphia's ritzy main line. But Barnes' shopping, I don't know if any of you have seen the new Barnes collection in downtown Philadelphia, but Barnes' shopping for El Grecos began early, well before Mr. Phillips. It began in 1914, when he acquired, albeit on approval, no fewer than 3 El Grecos. Among them, a painting identified as a portrait of the Cardinal Quiroga. He didn't like it. A small disrobing of Christ. I don't have a picture of it. And this rather strange St. Francis. But he sent them all back. Sent them back to the dealers in New York, from whom he acquired them on the grounds that they failed to harmonize color-wise with his other more modern pictures. The Cardinal, he explained, is so entirely different in key and color from the rest of the paintings that I can find no place to hang them, where it is in harmony with its surroundings. He had this very complicated ideas about color and tone and expressiveness that were the kind of the keys or the organizing principles of his collection. And it was the same with the disrobing of Christ. He sent it back, noting that my collection is exclusively a modern one, and in its present form is not only perhaps the most important in the country, but constitutes a harmonious whole as to color, etc. And I am exceedingly loath to disturb this harmony by the introduction of these old paintings which differ so materially in key from the modern masters which I have. As for the St. Francis, this he returned after someone he would only identify as, quote, an American living in Europe, Berenson perhaps, had informed him that he was not a genuine El Greco. Now, over the next decade, a string of dealers, American and European, peppered Barnes with the opportunity to purchase other works by our artists, among them such works as Christ in the House of Simon. I don't know where this one is. But he rejected them, telling one dealer, quote, the only El Grecos that interest me are the ones of bright color, and where he tells his story in color as only he and Cézanne can do it. In fact, only in 1923 did the rather finicky Dr. Barnes decide to finally buy a small El Greco, another disrobing of Christ, which he acquired in Paris. It's not really an El Greco, but it's a studio piece, not a bad one. He bought in Paris. It's still in the collection. Next came a painting acquired as 2 monks, actually St. Francis and Brother Leo, which he got from a Berlin dealer. Next came an Annunciation, Erich Galleries in New York. Finally, in 1930, his 4th, and in fact only truly genuine El Greco, the Vision of St. Hyacinth, which was sold to him by Julius Böder in Berlin. And he displayed each of these El Grecos in places where he believed they harmonized in terms of color and key with works by Van Gogh, Cézanne, Renoir, and other contemporary artists. And I'm sorry, I don't have a color photograph of where the St. Hyacinth is hanging in the New Barnes Museum in Philadelphia, as well as in the Old Barnes in Merritt. And such this kind of harmonious arrangement fitted with Barnes's overarching theories that he expressed in his book, The Art of Painting, first edition, 1924, where he expressed the view that despite El Greco's mysticism, and I quote, much of what is best in modern painting comes from El Greco. Sounds that he and Phillips were exchanging ideas about El Greco. Now, such ideas were nothing new, but they also explain, as we've just learned, why other devotees of contemporary art, such as Duncan Phillips, called El Greco the prophet of modern art, the founder of dynamic expressionism, you've just heard that, and thus an artist who anticipated modern art, and here he is in the Phillips today, where the St. Peter is juxtaposed with what I think is a Delacroix. That's Chester Dale. I believe he acquired St. Jerome, he was another collector of modern art, acquired St. Jerome in 1931. Ralph Coe in Cleveland, I don't know what Coe looks like, but he bought two El Grecos, the Annunciation, and that's a Holy Family, which he later gave away, and he juxtaposed those with his modern paintings, or I love this painting, or Marion McKay in San Antonio. In other words, all of these collectors of modern art gravitated at one point in their collecting careers to El Greco. And the same affinity seems to account for the purchase of three of El Greco's works by the last Philadelphia collector I will mention here, and evidently the last to display symptoms of Grecophilitis. Not well known, Theodore Pitcairn, a Swedenborgian clergyman and one of four heirs to the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company, a lot of money. Pitcairn is best known as a collector of Van Gogh. He owned three of them. And Monet. But starting in 1928, he added a quartet of El Grecos to his collection, starting with the family of El Greco, purchased from the estate of Peter Widener. Apparently Widener's kids wanted to get rid of that as fast as they could. Next came a crucifixion with a view of Toledo, possibly the one sold at Seligman's in New York in 1934, and I think it's something that resembles this picture now in Cincinnati. He also bought a St. John the Baptist and a St. Luke, all of which he displayed at his home in Bryn Ethan, Pennsylvania, just north of Philadelphia. By 1966, however, having weathered the worst of El Grecophilitis, Pitcairn sold most of his collection at auction. The Monets, his Van Goghs, and the three El Grecos. He put it all into his church, all the money into his church. He held on to the St. Luke, but that was a picture that was sold at Sotheby's in London just last year. Now, to be honest, not every collector who succumbed to El Grecophilitis did so as a result of that artist's perceived connection with modern or contemporary art. So we can change the title of this symposium a little bit. Those in this category included Andrew Mellon in Washington. He wanted a diverse collection. John Ringling in Sarasota. He had a very diverse collection, mostly old master art, not much interested in the moderns. Or the Putnam sisters in San Diego. They were buying El Grecos because they were simply trying to round out their collections. Or to take another example, the Mildred and Robert Bliss, two Washington collectors known for their interest in Byzantine art, and whose attraction to El Greco, which they purchased through their artistic advisor, Royal Tyler, you've heard his name before, described them in 1932 as an astonishing, beautiful El Greco, and they finally acquired it in January of 1936. And their interest in it, and it was a painting, by the way, that went for a time, I think, to that Brooklyn exhibition we learned about this morning, but I think it was in Washington by the spring of 36. It's best explained by the Bliss's perception that there was a linkage between El Greco's paintings and their interest in Byzantine art. He was from Crete, after all. But we're now in 1936. The Spanish Civil War is about to start. Laws that were in 1932, 1933, the Spanish Republic had instituted various laws prohibiting the export of important artworks from the country. It was getting really hard to get El Grecos out of Spain. El Grecos available for purchase were becoming increasingly scarce. But El Grecophilitis, that disease that first entered America via Philadelphia, by that time 36, late 30s, had lost much of the virulence that had previously fostered its spread. But the disease was by no means extinguished, as the National Gallery's acquisition of the Laocoon just after World War II suggests, or the Met's purchase in 1956, the spectacular vision of St. John, which had belonged to Ignacio Zuloaga, or Fort Worth's Kimball Museum's edition of this magnificent portrait in 1977 readily attest. But to conclude this presentation, there is perhaps another way to describe the country's affinity for works by our enigmatic artist. To do so, let me evoke the memory of this gentleman, undoubtedly an individual some of you will remember. John Carter Brown, director of the National Gallery in Washington from 1969 to 1992. Now, as Neil Harris reports in his recent book, Capital Culture, only months before his death in 2002, Carter reminisced about growing up in his family's house in Providence, where a painting by El Greco hung along, in the dining room, I should say, hung alongside a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci. Not bad. Now, Carter did not specify the picture in question, but it was evidently a picture of St. Dominic, which his father, John Nicholas Brown, had purchased in 1925. Now, Neil Harris does not say so directly, but this picture helps account, I think, for Carter's enthusiastic endorsement of the El Greco retrospective held at the gallery in 1982, in which Susan made mention of this morning. And it also explains a few years later, he did all that he could to persuade, now it was then Glasgow's Pollock House, to lend the gallery El Greco's Lady in Fur, or Lady in Ermine, a picture that Carter was desperate to include in his great British country house exhibition of 1985. But even Carter, who generally could borrow things from anybody, failed to get this picture. And when he learned the news, Carter drafted a memo expressing his distress. We should try to pull out all the stops. Americans love El Greco. Now, John Carter Brown was by no means infallible, but I think on that occasion, Carter was right. Thank you so much.